I was still in a hospital gown in my arm when I called my mother and asked her to take my newborn daughter for just a few hours. I'd just been in a car accident. My mother said no before I'd even finished the sentence. My name is Danielle McBurney. I'm 29 years old, and 3 hours after my mother hung up on me, my father, a man I hadn't spoken to in 11 years, walked through the hospital doors in Columbus, Ohio, still in his work boots. It started that morning on Route 33, a truck running a red light, my car spinning twice before it stopped. I walked away with a concussion and a fractured wrist. My daughter, 6 days old, was safe in her car seat. But I needed help immediately, and I called the one number I'd promised myself I'd never call again. "We're not really set up for a baby right now, Danielle," my mother said. "Ask someone else." She had no idea who was already driving toward that hospital, or what he was about to find out about the last 11 years. I'm not going to tell you what my father said when he walked into that hospital room yet. Not until you understand why he was the last person on earth I expected to show up. But first, do something for me. If you've ever been left alone when you needed your family most, hit subscribe right now. It takes 2 seconds and it tells me you're still here. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. Because in about 30 minutes, you're going to hear exactly what my father said to my mother when he found out what she'd done. For now, let's go back 11 years to a house outside Columbus, Ohio, where I learned exactly why I stopped speaking to my own father in the first place. To understand why my father, Walter McBurney, hadn't spoken a word to me in 11 years, and why my mother, Carol, could hang up on her own daughter hours after a car accident without a flicker of hesitation, you have to understand the house I grew up in outside Columbus, Ohio. I have one older brother, Bradley, 3 years ahead of me, and in our house, Bradley's needs were simply louder than mine in every sense that mattered. My father ran a small landscaping company, and from the time Bradley turned 16, he was groomed to take it over. Brought to job sites, taught the equipment, introduced to clients as the future of the business. I was never once offered that path, not because I lacked interest, but because nobody considered offering it to me in the first place. When I asked to come along one summer, my father told me landscaping wasn't really girls' work, and suggested I help my mother with the books instead. I was 14. My mother, for her part, ran the household with a rigid sense of who deserved what. Bradley's messes were forgiven quickly. Mine were lessons in responsibility. When Bradley wrecked my father's truck at 19, drunk, with no license restrictions violated only because my parents quietly handled it before police got involved, the incident was never mentioned again. When I came home 15 minutes past curfew at 16, having lost track of time at a friend's house, I lost driving privileges for a month. The math in our house never once landed in my favor, and by the time I was a teenager, I'd stopped expecting it to. The real fracture came when I was 18. I'd gotten into a state university 2 hours away with a partial scholarship, and I was excited, genuinely excited for the first time in years about a future that felt like mine. That same spring, Bradley, 21 at the time, got a young woman he'd been seeing pregnant. My parents' response was swift and, in hindsight, entirely predictable. They threw their full support behind Bradley, helped him and his girlfriend find an apartment, helped cover the first several months of rent, framed the whole situation to extended family as Bradley, stepping up admirably. Meanwhile, my college fund, money my parents had been saving since I was young, mysteriously came up $8,000 short of what I'd been told it contained. When I asked my father directly where the money had gone, he told me without much apology that some of it had gone toward helping Bradley get on his feet, and that I'd figure the rest out. I did figure it out, through loans, through 2 jobs, through a level of financial stress no 18-year-old should carry alone. But I never forgot the casual way he said it, like my future was simply the more flexible line item in the family budget. I graduated with significant debt that Bradley never had to consider for a single semester. I built my career slowly in medical billing and healthcare administration, moving up steadily despite the setback my parents had handed me at 18. I kept a polite, distant relationship with my family through my early 20s, holidays, occasional calls. But the closeness that should have existed between a daughter and her parents had eroded into something closer to obligation. The final break with my father came when I was 28. I'd started dating a man named Marcus Whitfield, a warehouse supervisor, kind and steady, someone who actually listened when I talked. My father, meeting him for the first time at a family barbecue, made a comment in front of the entire extended family about how he hoped I'd finally picked someone with real career potential this time. A direct dig at a previous relationship, delivered casually, cruelly, in front of people who all laughed along. I confronted my father privately afterward, calmly, asking him to never speak to me that way again, especially not in front of others. He told me I was being too sensitive, and that someone needed to keep me realistic since nobody else would. I told him that comment was the last one he'd ever get to make about my life. I meant it. I didn't speak to my father again for 11 years, not out of dramatic anger, but out of a quiet, permanent decision that I would no longer keep a door open for someone who used it only to walk through and criticize me. My mother, notably, never once intervened on my behalf during any of this. Not the college fund. Not the barbecue. Not the 11 years of silence that followed. She simply continued her relationship with my father, and a considerably thinner relationship with me, treating the entire rift as something that existed at a comfortable distance from her, rather than something she bore any responsibility for. Nobody in that family had any idea 11 years later exactly who would show up the day I needed help the most. The breaking point of this story isn't really about my father at all. It's about the morning of the accident itself, and what my mother chose to do in the hours immediately after. I'd given birth to my daughter Emily 6 days earlier, an uncomplicated delivery followed by a difficult recovery. More pain, more exhaustion than anyone had warned me about. Marcus had used almost all his paternity leave already, and that Tuesday morning he had one final mandatory shift he couldn't get out of without risking his job. I told him I'd be fine. I had a follow-up pediatrician appointment for Emily that morning anyway. Nothing complicated, just routine. I was 3 miles from the pediatrician's office on Route 33 when a delivery truck ran a red light at full speed and clipped the front quarter panel of my car, sending it spinning across 2 lanes before it came to a stop against a guardrail. I remember the sound more than anything, a violent, metallic scream, and then a strange, suspended silence afterward. My first thought before I even registered my own pain was Emily. I twisted around in my seat, wrist already throbbing in a way that told me something was broken, and found her exactly as I'd left her, secured in her car seat, crying but entirely unhurt. A paramedic later told me that specific car seat, positioned exactly the way it was, likely saved her life. I was taken to the hospital in Columbus with a fractured wrist and a concussion severe enough that doctors wanted to keep me overnight for observation. Emily, thankfully, was checked and cleared by pediatric staff within the hour, completely unharmed. But I was in no condition to care for a 6-day-old newborn alone overnight, dizzy, in pain, my dominant wrist in a temporary splint. Marcus was 2 hours away at a job site with no cell service, not answering, and wouldn't be reachable until his shift ended that evening. I called my mother from a hospital bed for already in my arm, and asked if she could come get Emily for just a few hours, just until Marcus was reachable or I was stable enough to manage on my own. It wasn't a large request. It was the kind of request most mothers would drop everything for. "We're not really set up for a baby right now, Danielle," she said, her voice flat, distracted, like I'd asked her to pick up a package rather than care for her own grandchild while her daughter lay in a hospital bed. "Your father and I have plans this evening. Ask someone else." I asked if she could send my brother Bradley instead. She told me Bradley was busy with his own kids, and that she really couldn't get into the middle of this. I asked, my voice breaking slightly, whether either of them could simply come sit with me at the hospital, not even take Emily anywhere, just be present. My mother said she'd see what she could do, and then didn't call back. I sat alone in that hospital room for the next 2 hours, a nurse periodically checking on Emily so I could rest my wrist, Genuinely alone in a way I hadn't felt since I was 18 years old and $8,000 short of a college fund I'd been promised. I wasn't angry yet. I was simply, quietly, devastated in a way that confirmed something I think I'd always suspected but never fully let myself believe. My family's help, when it existed at all, had always been conditional, and apparently even a car accident and a 6-day-old newborn didn't meet whatever threshold my mother required. I had no idea that 3 hours later, a truck I hadn't seen in 11 years would pull into that hospital parking lot. I want to pause the hospital room for a moment because to understand what happened next, you need to understand what those 11 years of silence with my father actually contained, not just for me but, as it turned out, for him too. After I cut contact with my father at 28, I threw myself fully into building a life that had nothing to do with his approval. I'd already been working steadily in medical billing and healthcare administration, but in the years following that final barbecue confrontation, I pursued it with a focus that surprised even me. I earned a certification in healthcare revenue cycle management, then moved into a compliance auditing role at a large hospital network based in Columbus, reviewing insurance claims and billing practices for accuracy and fraud prevention across multiple facilities. It was detail-heavy, exacting work, the kind that required catching small inconsistencies in enormous volumes of paperwork, and I turned out to be exceptionally good at it. Within 3 years I was promoted to senior compliance auditor, and by 27, the year before I stopped speaking to my father entirely, I was already earning more than both my parents combined, something none of them knew because none of them had asked. After the break with my father, I met Marcus, and within a year we'd moved in together, eventually buying a modest but comfortable home on the west side of Columbus, 20 minutes from my parents and an entire world away from the house I grew up in. I built a small, tight circle of friends and, eventually, a genuinely warm relationship with Marcus's own parents, who lived nearby and treated me with a curiosity and warmth my own family never quite managed. When I got pregnant with Emily, Marcus's mother threw me a baby shower that made me cry for reasons that had very little to do with hormones. My mother attended that baby shower briefly, mostly out of obligation, and left early, citing a prior commitment. My father wasn't invited. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 10 years by that point, and I genuinely believed, walking into that hospital on the day of the accident, that he would remain permanently absent from Emily's life. A decision I'd made peace with mostly, though not without an ache I rarely let myself examine too closely. What I didn't know during those 11 years of silence was what was happening on the other side of it. I learned much later that my father had gone through his own reckoning during that time. A health scare in his late 50s, a heart episode that landed him briefly in the hospital alone, because my mother had been traveling to visit Bradley's family at the time it happened. He told me eventually that lying in a hospital bed by himself that week had forced him to confront, in a way he'd avoided for years, exactly how thoroughly he'd damaged his relationship with his own daughter, and exactly how little his relationship with Bradley, built on convenience and approval rather than honesty, had actually sustained him when he needed real support. He didn't reach out to me during that recovery. He told me later he hadn't felt he'd earned the right to. Instead, he spent those 11 years doing something I never expected from him. Quietly, privately working through years of therapy, initially for unrelated anxiety following his heart scare, that eventually turned into a genuine, uncomfortable examination of the father he'd been. He never told my mother about most of it. She wasn't interested in that kind of reflection, he said later, and he'd stopped expecting her to be somewhere around the same time I had. None of this was visible to me, of course, during those 11 years. As far as I knew, my father remained exactly the man who'd told me I was too sensitive at a barbecue in front of extended family, and I built my entire life, my career, my home, my daughter's nursery without once factoring him back into it. I had no idea that somewhere in those same 11 years, my mother had mentioned in some brief, thoughtless phone call to my father that she likely didn't even remember by the time it mattered, that I'd had a baby, and that I'd just been in a car accident. I had no idea my father had heard that comment, hung up the phone, and without telling my mother, gotten straight into his truck. I was still alone in that hospital room, 3 hours after my mother told me she couldn't help, when I heard a knock at the door that made no sense to me at all. My father stood in the doorway, still in his work boots, his flannel shirt smelling faintly of cut grass and diesel, exactly as I remembered him except older, grayer, and wearing an expression I had genuinely never seen on his face before. Something close to fear. "Danielle," he said, his voice unsteady. "Your mother mentioned you'd had the baby. And then an hour ago she mentioned, almost like it was nothing, that you'd been in an accident this morning. I got in the truck before I even thought about it." I stared at him, my broken wrist aching in its splint, genuinely too stunned to speak for a moment. 11 years of silence, and he was standing in a hospital doorway because of an offhand comment my mother had apparently made without even registering its weight. "She called you?" finally asked. "Not to ask me to come," he said carefully. "She mentioned it in passing, talking about her evening plans, something about not wanting the timing to interfere with dinner with your brother's family. I don't think she meant to tell me at all. I don't think she thought I'd care." He paused and I watched something in his face crack slightly. "I got in my truck before she'd even finished the sentence." I didn't know what to say. Emily stirred in the bassinet beside my bed, a small, soft sound, and my father's eyes went to her immediately, something in his expression shifting entirely. "Is that her?" he asked quietly. "That's Emily," I said. He didn't ask to hold her. He didn't push forward or assume anything, which from the father I remembered, surprised me almost as much as his presence in the doorway at all. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, looking at his granddaughter for the first time, 11 years of silence sitting heavily in the space between us. "I know I don't have the right to walk in here after everything," he said. "I know 11 years doesn't undo with one drive to a hospital. But I couldn't sit at home tonight knowing you were here alone with a 6-day-old baby and a broken wrist, regardless of what's happened between us. I needed you to at least know that someone came." I felt something in my chest give way slightly, not full forgiveness, not yet, but something loosening after 11 years of assuming this man had simply stopped thinking about me entirely. "Why now?" I asked. "After everything you said. After everything you didn't say for 11 years. He pulled a chair over slowly, asking permission with his eyes before he sat, and told me haltingly about the heart scare I hadn't known about the hospital bed he'd woken up in alone, about years of quiet therapy he'd never mentioned to anyone in the family, working through exactly the kind of father he'd been to me and in different but related ways to Bradley. "I built a relationship with your brother out of convenience," he admitted. "It was easier to approve of him than to actually know him. And I built a wall between us out of my own pride because it was easier than admitting I'd been wrong about the barbecue, about the college money, about a lot of things I said to you over the years that I told myself for a long time you were simply too sensitive to hear correctly." While we were talking, my mother finally called my phone, 20 minutes after my father had arrived, likely realizing where his truck had actually gone. I let it ring twice before answering, mostly out of curiosity. "Is your father there?" she asked immediately, no greeting, an edge of something sharp in her voice I couldn't quite place. I mentioned the accident to him in passing. I didn't tell him to go. "He's here," I said, holding his granddaughter's bassinet steady while she sleeps, actually. There was a long pause on the line. "I told you I had plans tonight, Danielle." "I know," I said. "I just didn't realize the plans that mattered more than your daughter's hospital room were the same plans he apparently drove 2 hours away from without a second thought." My father, overhearing, gently took the phone from my hand, something he asked permission for with a simple glance, and I nodded, curious, exhausted, and strangely willing to see where this went. "Carol," he said into the phone, his voice steady in a way I hadn't heard from him in over a decade. "I need you to explain to me why our daughter called you from a hospital bed with a newborn and a broken wrist, and you told her you had dinner plans." I could hear my mother's voice through the phone, tinny and defensive, though I couldn't make out every word. My father listened for almost a full minute without interrupting, his jaw tightening slightly before he finally spoke again. Carol, I haven't spoken to Danielle in 11 years, he said. I know exactly whose fault that is, and I've spent a long time working through it, more than you know, honestly, because you never asked. But tonight, the moment I heard she'd been in an accident with a 6-day-old baby, I didn't think twice. I got in the truck. You are her mother. You've had a relationship with her this entire time. And your response was to tell her to ask someone else. There was a pause and then more tinny defensiveness from the other end. Something about Bradley, something about plans that had been made weeks in advance, something about not wanting to get in the middle of whatever was happening with the baby. Get in the middle of what exactly? My father said, his voice rising slightly for the first time. She had a car accident. She has a broken wrist. There is no middle to get in the middle of, Carol. There's just a daughter who needed help and a mother who was 20 minutes away and said no. I sat in that hospital bed watching my father defend me on the phone with a conviction I don't think I'd ever witnessed from him in my entire childhood. And something in me, some old, tired part that had spent 11 years assuming I simply didn't matter enough to either of my parents, quietly recalibrated. I'm going to be honest with you, my father continued, quieter now but no less firm. I spent years building a relationship with Bradley because it was easy, because he never challenged me, because approving of him cost me nothing. And I let that same laziness cost me 11 years with Danielle, over one comment I made at a barbecue that I've regretted more than almost anything else in my life. I'm not going to make that mistake again starting tonight. And I don't think you should either, Carol. Because right now, tonight, your daughter is sitting in a hospital bed alone with a newborn, and the only person who showed up is the one you probably assumed had given up on this family a long time ago. He hung up shortly after that without waiting for a response, and set the phone down gently on the bed beside me. I'm sorry, he said simply. For 11 years and for tonight, even though tonight wasn't really mine to apologize for. I'm sorry regardless. I looked at him for a long moment, this man who'd spent over a decade as a closed door in my life, now sitting beside my hospital bed at nearly midnight, having driven 2 hours the moment he heard I needed help, no hesitation, no conditions. I'm not saying everything's fixed, I told him honestly. 11 years doesn't undo in one night, and I need you to understand that whatever this becomes, it has to actually be different this time. Not just words. Actually different. I understand, he said. I'm not asking you to forget any of it. I'm asking for the chance to actually show you over time that I'm not the man who said those things at that barbecue anymore. I know I have to earn that. I'm not expecting it handed to me because I drove here tonight. My mother, notably, did not come to the hospital that night, or the following morning before I was discharged. She called once more briefly, offering a clipped, surface-level apology that focused more on being misunderstood than on what she'd actually done. I told her calmly that I appreciated the call, and that I needed some time before I decided what our relationship was going to look like going forward, the same way I was giving my father that same time and space to prove himself, rather than simply reopening a door because he'd shown up once dramatically when it mattered. My father stayed until Marcus finally arrived, having gotten cell service back the moment his shift ended and driving straight to the hospital in a panic once he heard what had happened. My father shook Marcus's hand for the first time in his life, quietly, respectfully, and told him, "Take care of them. I mean that in every way that word can mean." Then he left, giving us space, but not before holding Emily for the first time carefully, like something he understood he hadn't yet earned the full right to. I watched him leave the hospital room that night, and for the first time in 11 years, I didn't feel the familiar hollow ache of a father who'd simply stopped caring. I felt something more complicated, more hopeful, and considerably harder to sit with. The possibility that people can actually change quietly, privately, over years you never witnessed and show up exactly when it matters most, even after everything. It's been 4 months since that night in the hospital, and I want to tell you honestly, this story is still being written. I don't have a tidy bow to put on it, and I think that's actually the more truthful ending, even if it's not the most dramatic one. My father and I talk now regularly several times a week, and he's met Emily half a dozen times since that first night, always carefully, always waiting for me to invite him rather than assuming he's owed access simply because he showed up once when it counted. He's told me more about those 11 years of quiet therapy than I ever expected him to, uncomfortable conversations about the kind of father he was to me and the kind of father he wants to actually be to his granddaughter starting now. Not simply the version of himself he performed at family gatherings for Bradley's benefit. It isn't perfect. There are still moments where old patterns surface, an offhand comment that echoes the barbecue a little too closely, and I've learned to name those moments directly instead of swallowing them the way I used to. He's learned slowly to actually hear it when I do. My relationship with my mother remains far more complicated. She's called several times since that night, and each conversation has felt like she's waiting for me to simply move past what happened, to treat it as a misunderstanding rather than a choice she made while I sat alone in a hospital bed with a newborn. I've told her clearly more than once that I'm not interested in pretending it didn't happen, and that whatever relationship we rebuild has to start with her actually sitting with what she did, rather than rushing past it toward comfortable normalcy. She's not there yet. I don't know if she will be. I've made peace, cautiously, with the possibility that this particular relationship may stay at a careful distance for a long time, maybe permanently, and I no longer feel guilty about protecting myself and my daughter from a pattern I watched play out on me for 29 years. Bradley and I have talked too briefly, awkwardly. He didn't know about the $8,000 from my college fund until my father told him, recently, as part of his own reckoning with how differently he'd treated the two of us. Bradley apologized for things that honestly weren't his to apologize for. Being the favored child was never his fault any more than being the overlooked one was mine, but I appreciated that he was willing to sit with the discomfort of that conversation instead of avoiding it, which is more than either of our parents managed for most of my life. Here's what I want to say clearly to you watching this right now. I spent 11 years believing my father was simply a closed door permanently and that I'd made peace with that. What I learned this year is that people can change quietly, privately, over years you never witness, and that showing up, really showing up when someone needs you most, can matter more than any amount of time spent apart. But I also learned something else, something I think matters just as much. Change has to be proven, not just declared. My father earned back a place in my life not by driving to that hospital once, but by every quiet, consistent choice he's made since then to actually be different. A single dramatic gesture doesn't undo years of harm. It's just an opening, and what you do with that opening afterward is what actually determines whether the relationship deserves to continue. I also learned that you're allowed to hold two people to two completely different standards, based entirely on how they actually behaved when it mattered. My father showed up. My mother didn't. Those are simply facts, not grudges, and I don't owe either relationship the same level of trust just because they share the same last name I grew up with. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. You are allowed to keep a door closed for as long as it takes someone to actually prove they deserve it open again. And if someone does show up genuinely when you need them most after years of silence, you're allowed to let that matter cautiously without pretending it erases everything that came before it. I still live 20 minutes from the house I grew up in, close enough that my father can see his granddaughter grow up in a way he never fully showed up for with me. I'm still figuring out month by month what my relationship with my mother is going to become, if anything at all. And I still think sometimes about that hospital room and the sound of work boots in the doorway, 11 years of silence walking in because of a comment my mother never meant to let slip. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been let down by the person who was supposed to show up, and surprised by the one you'd already given up on, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and tell me about a moment someone showed up for you when you least expected it. I read every single comment, and whatever your version of that hospital room was, I promise you, you are not alone in it. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story.